Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Before I continue, please do me a huge favor and hit like on this video. But only if you're enjoying it. It helps me reach more people. Thank you so much. You're now in the horror section, and we're continuing with the next story. This story happened to me back when I drove trucks across the Midwest in the late 70s. I'd been driving for almost 15 years by then, ever since I got back from Vietnam. The open road was my therapy, my escape from the memories that haunted me. Back then, professional drivers had a different relationship with the highway. We were the lifeblood of America, moving goods when most folks were fast asleep. I typically preferred driving at night. Less traffic, cooler temperatures, and something about the darkness made me feel protected, anonymous. But not all of my overnight hauls were peaceful. Some nights, the emptiness of those endless highways created the perfect backdrop for things that shouldn't exist in our rational world. Of all the disturbing experiences I've had on the road, what happened on Route 37 through the Appalachian foothills still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. I've never shared this with anyone outside my small circle of trucker friends, but I think it's time people knew. It was mid-October, unusually cold for that time of year. I was hauling industrial equipment from Cincinnati to Baltimore, with my buddy Mac riding shotgun. We'd been partners on long hauls for about 3 years by then. Having another driver meant we could switch off and cover more ground, which translated to better pay. The route took us through some remote stretches of West Virginia, along winding roads that snaked between mountains so tall they seemed to swallow the moonlight. The scenery was breathtaking yet intimidating, just silhouettes of massive ridges against a star-filled sky. We were keeping each other awake with stories and jokes, radio playing some Creedence Clearwater Revival to keep the mood light. But that comfortable rhythm was about to be shattered completely. We were passing through a densely wooded section, no other vehicles for miles, when Mac suddenly tensed up beside me. "Jesus Christ, Hank. Stop the truck. Stop the truck," he shouted, pointing frantically toward the tree line. I hit the brakes, the weight of the trailer pushing against us as we came to a halt. I was confused, irritated even, until I turned to see what had Max so worked up. There, standing between two massive oak trees, about 20 yards from the shoulder, was a small figure. A little girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, standing motionless in the woods. At 2 in the morning, miles from any town or home, the headlights illuminated her enough to see that she was partially undressed, wearing only shorts despite the cold night. What looked like dark stains covered her chest and face. Mac was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "There's a kid out there, man. Look at her face, that's blood. Her family must have crashed somewhere off the road," he said, already opening his door. Something in my gut twisted. 20 years on the road teaches you to trust your instincts, and every one of mine was screaming that something wasn't right. But Mac was already halfway out of the cabin. "Wait," I called after him, but reluctantly followed. The powerful truck lights cast long shadows through the trees, creating a spotlight on this strange little girl. She just stared at us, her expression eerily vacant yet somehow aware. We approached slowly, Mac in front with his hands visible, speaking in a gentle voice. "Hey there, sweetie. Are you hurt? Where are your parents? How did you get all the way out here?" Not a word. Just that strange, unblinking stare. The bad feeling in my stomach grew stronger with each step. Every nerve in my body was urging me to turn around, get back in the truck, and drive away as fast as possible. But Mac kept moving forward, determined to help. As we got within 10 feet of her, the woods fell completely silent. No crickets, no distant owls, nothing but our footsteps on the autumn leaves. Then we saw it, and Mac's scream echoed through the trees. At the girl's feet lay a man's body, sprawled unnaturally on the forest floor. But what turned my blood to ice was his face, or rather, where his face should have been. It was just gone. A glistening red mess remained, and the girl's mouth and hands were covered in the same viscous substance. When she heard Max scream, she didn't run or look frightened. She simply crouched down and continued, feeding, like she was claiming her meal, worried we might take it from her. That's when we heard it, the sound of rapid movement through the underbrush coming from deeper in the woods. Not one person, but many, moving with purpose toward us. The crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs came from the darkness beyond, where our lights could reach. Mac and I didn't wait to see who or what was coming. We sprinted back to the truck, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I fired up the engine while Mac repeatedly yelled, "Go, go, Gio." I floored it, the tires spinning momentarily before catching grip on the asphalt. In the side mirror, I caught a glimpse of several figures emerging from the tree line, moving in that same unnaturally quick way the girl had stood, too still, then too fast. I didn't slow down until we reached a truck stop about 40 miles down the highway. With shaking hands, I called the state police from a pay phone. I described what we'd seen and where. The dispatcher's response chills me to this day. He didn't sound shocked or disbelieving. Instead, he calmly advised us to avoid that stretch of Route 37, especially after dark. When I pressed for an explanation, he simply said he needed to keep the line open for emergencies and hung up. That section of highway never appeared in any news reports. No missing persons, no investigations, nothing. When I asked other truckers, a few old-timers nodded knowingly but wouldn't elaborate. One guy who'd been driving those routes since the 50s finally told me over whiskey that there were certain families in those hills that predated the highways, predated the towns, maybe even predated the first settlers. The authorities leave them be, he said, as long as they stick to their territory. Sometimes they take hikers, sometimes broken down motorists. The cops know. They've always known. I never drove that stretch of Route 37 again. I requested different routes, even if it meant less pay. To this day, I can't shake the image of that little girl's face as she fed, or the casual way the police dispatcher warned us away without explanation. Whatever lives in those woods isn't human anymore, if it ever was. And the most terrifying part, they're still out there, watching the highways, waiting for someone to stop. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I spent over 20 years as a long-haul trucker. Drove my rig since the early 70s, finally hanging up my keys in 2010. All those years on the road left me with thousands of memories, some more horrifying than others. But this one I'm about to share. This was the most tragic of them all. I remember that night in '87 clearer than yesterday. I was driving with Mike, my best friend and fellow trucker. We often rode together in my 18-wheeler since our hauls stretched across the country, sometimes keeping us on the road for days at a time. He'd spell me at the wheel so I could rest, and I'd do the same for him. That night, we'd already been driving for 2 days straight and needed to reach our destination by morning. We were cruising down Route 16, that long stretch between Billings and Rapid City, where our final stop awaited. We were talking. I was behind the wheel, while Mike kept the conversation flowing to keep me alert. It was around 3 in the morning, when suddenly we spotted someone walking along the shoulder of the road. This person was heading in the same direction we were. Mike was pretty surprised to see anyone walking along this desolate stretch at such an ungodly hour. We couldn't tell if it was a man or woman because their entire body was covered by what looked like a dark gray poncho. "Should we stop and offer a ride?" Mike asked. I agreed it was the decent thing to do. I started slowing down, and we pulled alongside whoever it was. When we stopped, Mike called out through the window, asking if they wanted a lift, but the figure just kept walking, not turning or responding at all. We realized it was a woman because long hair stuck out from the front of her poncho, though we still couldn't see her face. Mike called out again, "Ma'am, can we help you with something?" But again, no response. Then Mike made the worst mistake of his life when, getting no answer and failing to make the woman even acknowledge us, he called out, "Hey lady, don't be rude." And in that moment, she slowly turned her head toward us. But it wasn't a woman, it was a skeleton. Just a skull without eyes, only bones without flesh. Mike screamed in terror as she stared at him. Her head was fully turned toward him, those empty sockets somehow fixed directly on his face. I was in shock, completely paralyzed for what felt like 10 endless seconds. When I finally came to my senses, I stomped on the gas and tore out of there at high speed. Mike was still screaming in fear, and I was terrified too. But I couldn't make a sound because of how badly I was paralyzed with dread. It was the most horrifying and disturbing thing I'd ever witnessed in my life. Finally, morning came, and we reached our destination, delivered our cargo, and drove to a cheap motel to spend the night and try to recover from such an immense fright. We still couldn't calm ourselves. Neither of us could find any peace. We had no idea what kind of entity that was in the middle of a deserted highway. Mike called his wife, but didn't tell her anything because he didn't want to worry her. I remember how at the end of the call, he told her he wanted morning to come faster, and for the days on the road to pass quickly, so he could finally return home to her and their little daughter. After that, we went to sleep. Early the next morning, we hit the road again. This time Mike was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. Everything was going fine, until suddenly another semi decided to pass a school bus coming from the opposite direction, causing the most horrific accident of my life. Mike, my colleague and friend, died instantly. I emerged without a scratch, and the driver of the other truck wasn't hurt either. Mike was the only fatality in that crash. I started screaming for help until finally the paramedics and ambulance arrived. But there was nothing they could do for him. But there was something else that shook me deeply. When they pulled me from the truck and were treating me in the ambulance, I realized we were at the exact same spot where 2 nights before we had encountered that skeleton. That's when I understood that what had appeared to us was Death herself, who had taken my friend because he had disrespected her that night. I passed out and didn't know where I was until I woke up in a hospital back in my hometown. I had no idea how I'd gotten there. Many years passed before I could process that tragedy that took my good friend. I continued working as a truck driver because it was what I loved, and truthfully, the money was good. But whenever I drove that stretch of highway, I paid my respects to what doesn't belong to this world. Many times I saw suffering souls that later vanished into nothing. I no longer stopped on that road to see if anyone needed help. I just kept driving. I worked like this for another 15 years before retiring. But there's one more story worth telling. It happened just before my retirement. I was driving along Interstate 90, somewhere between Sheridan and Buffalo, Wyoming. And this time I was with a new partner named Lucas. We were talking. It was already deep into the night, and I was starting to get drowsy. So we decided to pull over so Lucas could take the wheel, and I could catch some sleep in the sleeper cabin. When he got behind the wheel, I had just started getting comfortable in the back when he said, "Ray, look at that." "What the hell is that?" I pulled back the curtain to look and saw some kind of animal walking on 2 legs, approaching our truck. We couldn't tell what it was yet because it was still far off, but it looked very strange and downright eerie. Lucas asked if it was an animal, a person, or something else entirely, and I told him we needed to get out of there. Whatever it was, it clearly wasn't anything good. So he tried to start the engine, but we were stuck. Seems like there had been rain, and the shoulder was muddier than we'd realized. He kept trying to move, but the truck wouldn't budge. That creature kept getting closer, and we started to make out its shape. It looked like a bull, but standing on 2 legs. And then suddenly the creature stopped. It didn't move forward anymore, just stood there staring at us. We didn't take our eyes off it, afraid it might attack. I told Lucas to move over and let me try to get the truck moving, but my attempts didn't fare any better. One of us had to get out to check the wheels, but neither wanted to do it. That creature was still standing there, watching us. I decided to get out and get it over with, but Lucas told me not to, saying the creature was waiting for one of us to exit so it could attack or do something terrible. I told him I didn't believe in such nonsense, and that he shouldn't be so superstitious. But he asked if I couldn't feel the heavy energy that had filled the air since that thing appeared. Honestly, I did feel it, and experienced a kind of fear I'd never known before. The atmosphere was deeply unsettling, but I didn't want to feed into his theories about what it was, so I told him not to worry and to help me get the truck moving. He begged me again not to go out, explaining that his grandfather, who'd also been a trucker for decades, had told him stories about creatures like this. Suddenly, a cold wind started blowing, and I began hearing voices around us. The wind whistling through the trees created such an atmosphere of anxiety that I couldn't concentrate. I was barely holding it together, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening wasn't normal. It was something beyond comprehension. I tried to make sense of it all, but the more I listened to these voices, the more horrifying they became. They sounded like someone begging for help, but there wasn't a soul in sight. I sat in the cab, stunned and frightened, praying for it all to end. I knew I needed to stay calm, but this cold wind and these voices, I couldn't understand what was happening. Finally, I saw lights in the distance, and although my heart was racing faster, I decided to try to flag down whoever was coming. I stuck my arm out to signal, and as the vehicle approached, I immediately headed toward it, hoping someone would stop to help. To my surprise, the car passed by without stopping, and again I was left alone with those strange voices that were now beginning to fade into silence. Deep down, I knew this wasn't just coincidence. This place had its own dark history, and what was happening wasn't of this world. As soon as the car disappeared over the horizon, I couldn't take it anymore and returned to the truck, trying once more to start the engine. I felt completely helpless. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to collect myself, and when I opened them again, I saw my hands trembling with fear. I could feel the darkness of this place enveloping me, and I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I tried to start the truck once more, and this time, to my great surprise, the engine roared to life, and I felt everything returning to normal. I didn't hesitate and immediately drove off. As I left that sinister location, I began to feel the fear gradually subsiding. But this incident left a deep mark on my soul. Since then, I've changed my attitude about such places, and always remembered that sometimes it's better to leave such situations unexamined than to seek answers to what truly defies explanation. A few years back, I lost my job at the manufacturing plant in Nebraska when they decided to move production overseas. I was desperate for work when my cousin Eric, who worked as a long-haul trucker, mentioned that his company was looking for more drivers to transport materials across state lines. There was just one condition. I needed my own rig, as their fleet was fully deployed. "I can help you find an affordable truck," Eric told me one evening over beers. "The investment will pay itself back within the first few weeks of hauling." He lived in a nice house in the suburbs and drove a new pickup for personal use, so I figured he knew what he was talking about. "The more routes you take, the more cash you make," he assured me. I didn't need much convincing. My savings were dwindling, and the job market in our town had dried up since the plant closure. That same week, Eric called me about a semi he'd found through a connection at a truck yard outside of Rapid City, South Dakota. The price was suspiciously low, but he insisted it was a legitimate deal. "The owner needs to offload it quickly," he explained. Bankruptcy situation. When we went to inspect it, I was surprised by the truck's condition. It was a 5-year-old Peterbilt with relatively low mileage and a spacious sleeper cab. The trailer was in decent shape too, a standard 53-foot dry van that had been recently repainted. I checked the engine, brakes, and tires, finding everything in working order. The deal seemed too good to be true, but I was desperate and used nearly all my savings to buy it. Within a week, I had my commercial license transferred and began working as an independent contractor for Eric's company. My first haul was uneventful, a load of packaged furniture from Rapid City to Denver. The second trip, however, is one I'll never forget. I was assigned to transport pallets of boxed electronics from a warehouse in South Dakota to a distribution center in Missoula, Montana. It was late October, and the weather forecast warned of an early winter storm moving across the northern Rockies. I wanted to get ahead of the weather, so I loaded up in the afternoon and planned to drive through the night. By 10 o'clock, I was on a remote stretch of I-90, about 100 miles east of Billings. The night was moonless, with thick clouds blocking any starlight. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, and occasional snowflakes began to dance in their beams. That's when I first heard it, a dull thudding coming from the trailer behind me. At first, I thought it might be part of the load shifting. I turned down Waylon Jennings on the radio to listen more carefully. The sound came again, more distinct this time. 3 deliberate knocks followed by silence, then 3 more. Too rhythmic to be cargo, moving around. My mouth went dry. I was alone on this stretch of highway, with nothing but miles of empty prairie surrounding me. The knocking continued, growing more insistent with each passing minute. I spotted a rest area ahead and pulled in, the only vehicle there at that late hour. Grabbing my heavy flashlight, I climbed down from the cab, the cold air biting at my face. The knocking had stopped the moment I cut the engine. I approached the rear of the trailer cautiously, listening. Nothing but the whistle of wind across the empty parking lot. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer doors and swung them open. Everything looked exactly as I had loaded it, pallets of electronics secured with straps, nothing amiss. I climbed inside anyway, sweeping my flashlight across every corner and crevice. The beam bounced off cardboard boxes and metal strapping, revealing nothing unusual. Confused but somewhat relieved, I secured the doors again and continued my journey. Maybe it had been road noise, or my imagination working overtime on too little sleep. 5 minutes later, the knocking returned. Louder this time. Desperate somehow, I could feel the vibration of it through my seat. Thud, 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 pause, thud, thud, thud. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I wasn't stopping again, not on this deserted stretch of highway in the middle of the night. I cranked the radio up, trying to drown out the sounds, but they penetrated through Waylon's voice, through the roar of the engine, through everything. For the next 2 hours, the knocking continued intermittently. Sometimes it would stop for 10 or 15 minutes, giving me hope that whatever it was had ended. Then it would start again, more frantic than before. By the time I reached the outskirts of Billings, my nerves were shot. I pulled into a brightly lit truck stop and called Eric, not caring that it was after midnight. "There's something wrong with this rig," I told him, my voice shaking. "I keep hearing knocking from the trailer. I checked it and there's nothing there, but it won't stop." Eric was quiet for a moment. "Where did you say you bought the truck from again?" "That yard outside Rapid City. Your friend Jackson's place." "He's not exactly a friend," Eric said slowly. "Look, finish this delivery, then bring the truck back to South Dakota. I'll meet you there." The rest of the journey was torture. Even with the storm picking up, dropping visibility to a few dozen yards at times, I couldn't shake the awareness of those knocks. like phantom limb pain from a missing appendage. When I finally reached Missoula the next morning, I unloaded as quickly as possible and immediately headed back east, driving straight through with minimal stops. The knocking had stopped once the cargo was removed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, waiting. 2 days later, I met Eric at the truck yard. A different manager was on duty, an older woman named Marge with deep creases around her eyes. When I described what had happened, her expression darkened. "Who sold you this rig?" she asked sharply. I gave her Jackson's name, and she cursed under her breath. "That truck wasn't for sale," she said, walking around to inspect the trailer more closely. "It was supposed to be impounded." "What do you mean?" Eric asked. Marge sighed heavily, running her hand along the newly painted side of the trailer. "About 8 months ago, this rig was found abandoned at a border checkpoint in North Dakota. When they opened it up, they found 3 young men inside, refugees trying to cross into Canada. They'd been locked in with inadequate ventilation. My blood ran cold. They'd been in there for at least 4 days," she continued. "None of them survived. The authorities held the truck during the investigation. Then it was supposed to be impounded pending auction. Looks like someone repainted it and moved it to our back lot illegally." In that moment, I understood what or who had been knocking. 3 desperate souls, still trapped in their final moments, still hoping for rescue. I sold the truck the very next day at a substantial loss and walked away from trucking forever. Some nights I still wake up to the sound of knocking, 3 deliberate thumps in the darkness, even though I know there's nothing there. At least I hope there isn't. My grandfather was a long-haul trucker in the 90s, working routes across the Pacific Northwest. He'd been driving for over 20 years by then, and had collected enough stories to fill a book, some thrilling, some heartwarming, but a few that would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up straight. Back then, he'd tell us, the mountain roads were mostly safe. You could drive through the night without much worry beyond the occasional elk or deer crossing your path. But there were certain stretches, certain forgotten corners of those woods where things got strained. This particular incident happened with his co-driver Jackson, who'd been his buddy since they both started working for Summit Freight Lines. They were hauling timber processing equipment from Portland to a small mill town in northern Idaho, pushing through the early hours before dawn to make their delivery on schedule. They'd been on the road for about 18 hours, and fatigue was starting to set in. Jackson, who prided himself on knowing every shortcut from Seattle to Salt Lake City, suggested they take Route 17, an old logging road that would shave nearly an hour off their journey. "I've driven it dozens of times," Jackson assured my grandfather. "It's bumpy as hell, but it'll get us there before sunrise." My grandfather trusted Jackson's judgment. After all, the man had been driving these mountains since my grandfather was still hauling short routes in the valley. So they turned off the main highway onto Route 17, the headlights of their Peterbilt cutting through a fog that seemed to grow thicker with every mile. The road narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains. They had their windows rolled down despite the chill. The truck's heater had been working overtime, and the cab was stifling. Beyond the rumble of the diesel engine, the night was alive with sounds. Wind through pine trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the constant symphony of insects that called the forest home. They were trading stories about the worst diners they'd ever eaten when something made them both fall silent. At first, it was barely perceptible over the engine noise. What sounded like laughter, high-pitched and childlike, coming from somewhere in the woods alongside the road. "You hear that?" Jackson asked, turning down the CB radio that had been crackling with static. My grandfather nodded, leaning toward his open window. The laughter continued, seeming to follow alongside the truck as they crawled up the winding road at maybe 20 miles per hour. Probably just some teenagers camping, my grandfather suggested, though even as he said it, he knew it didn't make sense. They were at least 15 miles from the nearest town, on a service road that wasn't marked on most maps, in the middle of a moonless night. The laughter grew louder, multiplying until it sounded like there were maybe 5 or 6 voices, all giggling in a way that wasn't quite right. It wasn't the sound of children having fun. There was something almost mocking about it. "Kids wouldn't be out here," Jackson muttered, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Not at 3 in the morning, not this far up." They drove on for another mile or so, the laughter keeping pace with them despite the truck moving faster now. My grandfather reached over and rolled up his window, and Jackson did the same, even though the cab immediately became uncomfortably warm. That's when the first impact hit, a sharp crack against my grandfather's door. "What the hell was that?" he said, straightening up in his seat. Before Jackson could answer, there was another crack, then another. Small stones were hitting the truck from both sides, pinging off the metal and thudding against the windows. "Pull over," my grandfather said, his temper flaring. He'd spent his own money repainting the truck just 2 months earlier, and the thought of some pranksters causing damage made his blood boil. Jackson braked, pulling the rig to the side of the narrow road, where a small clearing offered just enough space. My grandfather grabbed the heavy maglite he kept under his seat, both a tool and, if needed, a weapon. He'd had to chase off would-be thieves at rest stops before, and he wasn't about to let some backwoods hooligans vandalize his livelihood. "Stay here," he told Jackson, who looked relieved not to be the one stepping outside. "I'll handle this." The moment my grandfather's boots hit the gravel, the laughter stopped. The forest fell into an unnatural silence. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the tree line, the light barely penetrating the dense undergrowth. That's when he caught a glimpse of movement about 20 yards into the woods. He trained the light on that spot and felt his entire body go cold. Between the trees, partially hidden behind a rotting log, were 3 figures no taller than 3 feet. Their skin was a mottled gray-green, stretched tight over elongated faces with eyes that reflected the flashlight beam like a deer's, but much larger, taking up too much of their faces. They were hairless, with pointed ears that lay flat against their skulls as they shrank away from the light. One of them grinned at my grandfather, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It raised a gnarled, 4-fingered hand as if in greeting or warning, before scuttling backward into the darkness on all 4s, moving with a spider-like quickness that defied natural movement. I've never seen my grandfather move so fast as he did in that moment, according to his story. He was back in the cab, slamming the door and yelling at Jackson to drive. "Just drive," Now, before his mind had fully processed what he'd seen, Jackson floored it, the truck's tires spinning on loose gravel before finding purchase. They tore up that mountain road at a speed that could have sent them plummeting over the edge with one wrong move. My grandfather couldn't speak for nearly 20 minutes, just staring out the windshield with wide eyes, occasionally checking the side mirrors as if expecting to see something following them. When they finally reached the main highway, dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. In the growing light, Jackson pulled into a truck stop and turned to my grandfather. "What did you see back there, Charlie?" he asked, his face ashen. My grandfather described the creatures in a voice that didn't sound like his own. When he finished, he expected Jackson to laugh it off or suggest he'd been hallucinating from exhaustion. Instead, Jackson nodded slowly and said, "The Watchers. That's what old Pete Miller used to call them." "You've heard of these things?" my grandfather asked incredulously. "Never seen 'em myself," Jackson admitted. But Pete swore he encountered something similar up near Cascade Ridge in '87. Said they followed his truck for nearly 5 miles, throwing pine cones and rocks. The company made him see a psychiatrist, and he quit driving mountain routes after that. They sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the sun climb higher, burning away the nighttime shadows. They finished their delivery 4 hours late, making up a story about engine trouble to explain the delay. Neither of them ever took Route 17 again. My grandfather told this story only a handful of times throughout his life. He wasn't a man given to exaggeration or tall tales. When I asked him years later if he truly believed what he saw, he fixed me with a look I'll never forget. "There are things in this world that don't fit neatly into the boxes we create for them," he said quietly. "Things that were here long before us and will be here long after. We're just passing through their territory." He never drove through the mountains at night again, even if it meant missing a deadline. Some shortcuts, he learned, come with prices too steep to pay. So that's the story, exactly as he told it to me. Believe it or don't, that's your choice. But next time you're driving a lonely road after midnight, and you hear something that sounds like laughter coming from the darkened woods, keep your windows up, your eyes forward, and your foot heavy on the accelerator. Some things are better left unpursued. My name is Frank. For over 30 years, I drove 18-wheelers across the country for various shipping companies before retiring last year at 72. Throughout my career on the road, I've experienced more than my share of strange occurrences. But there's one story that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I recall it. It happened about 15 years ago. I was hauling industrial equipment from Nebraska to Montana along Interstate 90. I'd been driving for nearly 12 hours straight, and night had fallen hours earlier. Unlike most truckers, I actually preferred driving after dark, fewer vehicles on the road. And I appreciated that sense of solitude, just me and the endless ribbon of highway stretching out before my headlights. I had the radio tuned to some classic country station, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, when I spotted someone in the distance. A lone figure standing on the shoulder, arm extended in the universal hitchhiker gesture. In those days, it wasn't unusual to see people thumbing rides, and I'd always been the type to lend a hand when I could. This night was no different. As I pulled over, I got a better look at him. An older gentleman, probably in his mid-60s, wearing worn-out clothes that seemed several sizes too big. Dust covered his jacket and pants like he'd been walking for days. "Where you headed?" I called out as he approached. "My truck broke down about 2 miles back," he replied in a gravelly voice. "Been standing here for hours. Nobody stops anymore." His eyes never quite met mine. "Hop in," I offered. "I've got tools in the back. Maybe we can get you rolling again." He climbed into the passenger seat without another word, just stared straight ahead through the windshield. The cabin filled with an unusual chill, despite the warm September night. "Which company you drive for?" I asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. No response. "You all right, buddy? Your clothes look pretty beat up." I glanced over at him. Again, nothing but silence. By then, I realized we'd traveled well past the 2-mile mark, where his truck should have been. The empty road stretched before us, no disabled vehicle in sight. I cleared my throat nervously. "Are you sure it wasn't farther up? I don't see any truck." He slowly raised one finger and pointed straight ahead. "Just keep driving." An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, but I continued on. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as the night grew darker around us. The stranger hadn't uttered a single word since entering my truck. Suddenly, I noticed something disturbing on the mile marker. We were passing mile marker 297. The exact same marker where I'd picked him up. Impossible. I'd been driving straight the entire time. No turns, no exits. We couldn't have circled back. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered, more to myself than my passenger. The hitchhiker remained motionless, eyes fixed forward. The atmosphere in the cabin had become suffocating. "Listen, I think you need to get out now," I said firmly, pulling onto the shoulder. "This isn't right." Without protest, he opened the door and stepped out. No thanks, no goodbye, not even a backward glance. I watched through my side mirror as he walked toward a thick stand of pine trees bordering the highway. Within seconds, his silhouette melted into the darkness. I sat there, engine idling, debating what to do. Leaving someone alone on this remote stretch of highway at night seemed wrong. But his disappearance into the forest left me with little choice. Just as I was about to pull back onto the road, another semi rolled up behind me and stopped. The driver, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, approached my window. I stepped down from my cab to meet him. "You need to get moving, friend," he said without preamble. "I saw you pick up that man." "How did you?" "I've been driving this route for 20 years, he cut in. "That man you picked up. He was a trucker who died in a head-on collision right at this mile marker back in 1989. Exactly where you're parked now." My blood ran cold. For years, he's been appearing to drivers at night, asking for rides. Those who stop, his voice trailed off. They vanish. He told me about his cousin, who disappeared last winter along this same stretch. They had been talking over the CB radio when his cousin mentioned stopping for a stranded trucker. That was the last anyone ever heard from him. Dozens of other drivers had reported similar encounters. A man in tattered clothes near mile marker 297. And those who offered rides were never seen again. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're still here," he replied, eyes wide with disbelief. "Nobody who picks him up ever makes it past this point. You're the first one I've met who came back. I thanked him for the warning, my hands trembling as I climbed back into my cab. "We look out for our own," he called after me. "But if you drive this route again, and you see him standing there, don't stop. Just keep going." I drove away from mile marker 297 that night and never took another job along Interstate 90. In all these years since, I've never understood why that restless spirit let me go when so many others vanished without a trace. It's a question I suspect will haunt me until my dying day. I've been hauling freight across the Midwest for almost 7 years now. It's how I've made my living since moving to America from Ukraine back in 2017. I've always stuck to daylight runs because I've got this problem with drowsiness behind the wheel. My body just wants to shut down when darkness falls. And I learned that lesson the hard way 3 years ago when I dozed off and sideswiped a guardrail outside of Tulsa. Thankfully, nobody got hurt, but my rig needed some serious work, and my boss wasn't too happy about it. That's why I was hesitant when dispatch called with an emergency haul from Indianapolis to Albuquerque. A sweet $2,200 bonus if I could get there by noon the next day. Money like that doesn't come around often, especially for an independent contractor like me. I figured I'd load up on energy drinks, crank my playlist of Ukrainian heavy metal, and power through the night. I hit Route 17 around 1 in the morning. The road cut through the plains of western Kansas, usually monotonous but peaceful. The moon was just a sliver that night, and the stars were incredible. One of the few perks of overnight driving through the middle of nowhere. There were only a handful of vehicles on the road, a couple of cars ahead of me, and what looked like another trucker's headlights in my rear view. That's when things got strange. At first, I thought it was heat lightning on the horizon, but it was too concentrated, too rhythmic. The sky began to open up, I guess you could say. Not like clouds parting, more like the fabric of the night itself was being peeled back. Where the sky should have been pitch black, it turned an unnatural shade of violet gray, pulsing with what looked like electricity, but moved more like liquid. The two cars ahead of me began to slow down. I eased off the accelerator too, trying to process what I was seeing. Within minutes, a line of vehicles had formed behind me, everyone transfixed by whatever was happening above us. I reached for my phone to record it. Brand new iPhone 15 Pro Max I'd splurged on just last week. But when I tried to open the camera, the screen flashed bright white, then went completely blank. I tried restarting it, but nothing happened. Looking around, I could see other drivers outside their vehicles, frantically tapping at their devices. One woman was shaking her phone violently, as if that would fix whatever was wrong with it. Then we all saw it, something massive descending through that strange rift in the sky. It wasn't falling, it was gliding down with deliberate control. I can't tell you its exact shape, because it seemed to shift and blur around the edges. The best I can describe it is like a charcoal-colored teardrop, the size of a football field. But even that doesn't capture what we were seeing. Just as this thing was about to dip below the tree line about a half-mile off the highway, 3 black Suburbans and 2 unmarked helicopters appeared out of nowhere. The vehicles cut across the median and blocked both lanes of the highway. Men in dark tactical gear. Not police, not military exactly, but something else jumped out and began directing traffic. Turn around now. This area is being evacuated due to a chemical spill. Follow the detour signs. One of them shouted through a bullhorn. A woman from the car in front of me got out and started arguing. What chemical spill? We all saw what's happening up there. 2 agents immediately converged on her. I couldn't hear what they said, but she got back in her car quickly, looking shaken. When I rolled down my window to ask how long the detour would take, the agent just stared at me through mirrored sunglasses. At 1 a.m, mind you, and said, "Sir, this is a matter of national security. Follow the detour route or face immediate detention. We are authorized to confiscate any recording devices." I'm not one to argue with guys carrying military-grade weapons, so I made a U-turn like everyone else. They directed us onto a series of back roads that added nearly 3 hours to my journey. The weird thing was, as soon as we were about 5 miles from that spot, all our phones suddenly powered back on like nothing had happened. Mine even had a full battery. The next morning, I scoured every news outlet I could find. Nothing, not a single report about a highway closure, a chemical spill, or anything unusual in Kansas. I even called the State Highway Patrol, who claimed Route 17 had been open all night with no incidents. 3 days later, I got a strange call from a blocked number. A man's voice simply said, "Mr. Petrenko, for your safety and the safety of your family back in Lviv, we advise you to consider what happened on Route 17 as nothing more than a dream. Dreams aren't worth talking about, are they?" Then he hung up. I've never spoken about it publicly until now, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, remembering that violet-gray tear in the sky and wondering what really came down to earth that night and who was waiting for it. I've been hauling freight across the country with my 18-wheeler for the better part of a decade now. It's grueling, demanding work that sometimes puts you in harm's way, especially when you're traversing the more remote stretches of Montana and Wyoming, where some roads wind treacherously through mountain passes, or cut through areas where help is hours away if anything goes wrong. But this particular experience I'm about to share with you sent chills down my spine like nothing else ever has. That night, I had already been on the road for what felt like an eternity. The stretch between Helena and Billings takes you through some of the most isolated terrain in the northern Rockies. Hairpin turns hugging mountainsides with steep drop-offs that would make even veteran drivers white-knuckle the steering wheel. To make matters worse, Mother Nature decided to throw a wicked autumn storm my way. The rain was coming down in sheets, occasionally mixing with sleet that pinged against my windshield like tiny bullets. I wasn't as seasoned back then as I am now, only about 3 years into the job, and I'm not ashamed to admit those mountain curves had me on edge, especially at night with the rain obscuring my vision. Like I mentioned, I'd been driving for close to 15 hours straight, and fatigue was starting to cloud my judgment. My eyelids felt like they had lead weights attached to them. I knew I needed to pull over and catch some shut-eye. Continuing would have been downright dangerous. Problem was, the nearest proper rest stop was still about 40 miles ahead, and in that weather, That meant at least another hour of white-knuckle driving. So I started looking for any suitable spot where I could safely park my rig and catch a few hours of sleep in the cab. Eventually, I found a small clearing just off the highway, nestled between a dense pine forest and the base of a towering cliff face. The spot was eerily quiet when I cut the engine, the only sound being the steady drumming of rain against the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and an umbrella, then stepped out to answer nature's call before settling in for the night. The forest was pitch black, and the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness between the tall pines. After taking care of business, I trudged back through the mud to my truck, but something stopped me cold. The steps leading up to the passenger side door had fresh, muddy footprints on them, footprints that weren't mine. And the door, which I distinctly remember closing, was slightly ajar. I could see the interior light was on, though I was certain I'd switched everything off. My heart started hammering against my ribcage. Someone had gotten into my truck while I was gone. I cautiously approached, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, and called out, "Who's in there?" "Come out now." Nothing but silence answered me. I slowly pulled myself up and peered inside, then carefully drew back the curtain that separated the cab from the sleeping area. But before I could fully open it, I heard it. A man's voice, choked with emotion, pleading, "Help her, please. Just help her." I yanked the curtain back in one swift motion, but the sleeper compartment was empty. Completely empty. How was that possible? That voice had clearly come from inside. I started shaking uncontrollably, scanning every corner of the cab. That's when I noticed something strange tucked away on the upper shelf near the corner. A weathered, dirt-encrusted child's teddy bear with patches of its fur missing, and one button eye hanging by a thread. It looked ancient and out of place, like something that had been buried and recently unearthed. Where the hell had it come from? I didn't put it there, and I certainly didn't have any children. Something about that bear made my skin crawl. I grabbed it and hurled it out the door into the rain. I slammed and locked both doors, fired up the engine, and decided that sleep could wait. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I pulled back onto the highway. I was running on fumes, both literally and figuratively, having been awake for nearly 24 hours straight. The combination of exhaustion and adrenaline made the road ahead seem to waver and distort. As I tried to maneuver back onto the main road, there was a sickening crunch beneath my wheels. I backed up slightly and stepped out to check what I'd hit. Walking to the front of my truck, the beam of my flashlight revealed 3 wooden crosses planted in the ground, 2 of which I had partially crushed. I moved closer to inspect them and noticed a small laminated card attached to one cross that had somehow survived intact. The card read, "Rest in peace, the Blackwood family." Beside the text was a faded photograph of a young couple with their infant daughter, no more than 1 year old. According to the dates below their names, they had perished at this very spot just 5 years ago, when their car lost control in a storm similar to tonight's. Everything suddenly clicked into place. Those footprints, that desperate voice begging for help, it must have been the ghost of Mr. Blackwood still trying to save his child, even in death. A lump formed in my throat, and tears welled in my eyes. My wife was 7 months pregnant with our first child back home in Bozeman. And in just a few weeks, I'd be a father myself. I couldn't imagine the anguish that poor man must feel. His paternal instinct so powerful that it transcended the barrier between life and death. I carefully repaired the crosses as best I could and placed the teddy bear, which I found lying just a few feet away, back against the middle cross. Before leaving, I promised aloud to drive more carefully, especially in bad weather, and to always remember the Blackwood family. It was all I could offer. That was 3 years ago, and I've kept my word. Every time I pass that stretch of road, I slow down and say a little prayer for them. And when my daughter asks why we always have to check her car seat 3 times before we drive anywhere, I simply tell her it's because someone once taught me how precious and fragile life truly is. This story didn't happen to me, but to my uncle's closest friend back in the mid-90s. Uncle Jack always told this story to me and my cousins during our summer visits to Montana, insisting it was absolutely true despite how unbelievable it sounds. It became something of a legend among the truckers in that region. My uncle dedicated his entire life to long haul, trucking across the Pacific Northwest. Though our family has roots in Idaho, the open road was his true home, and he spent nearly every waking moment traversing the endless highways that cut through our country's most remote wilderness. Over the decades, Uncle Jack formed deep bonds with many fellow truckers. This particular story begins when his buddy Liam was driving north on Highway 12 through the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho on a crisp autumn night. That same evening, Jack was hauling cargo along the Oregon coast. They often kept each other company over the CB radio during these solitary journeys, a tradition among truckers to ward off the loneliness of the road. Jack was traveling with his dog, an old border collie named Russet, while Liam was completely alone on his route, something Jack always warned against, especially on the more isolated stretches. They were sharing stories and laughing over the crackling radio when, around 11:30 at night, with only a sliver of moon illuminating the landscape, Liam's voice suddenly changed. "Jack, you seeing anything weird on your end tonight?" Liam asked, his normally steady voice hesitant. "Nothing but pitch black and pine trees," Jack replied. "Why, what are you seeing? There's something strange up ahead," Liam said. "In the valley between those 2 ridges. Lights not like headlights or cabin lights. They're pulsing, almost like they're hovering." Jack and Russet exchanged glances. Maybe it's those forest rangers doing night surveys, or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, Jack suggested, though something in Liam's voice made the hair on his neck stand up. "No, these are moving in formation. Too deliberate. They're getting closer to the highway now, moving fast." Liam's voice suddenly cut off. The radio fell silent for several heartbeats. "Liam, you still there, buddy?" Jack called out, adjusting the dial. Nothing but static filled the cab. Then Liam's voice returned, but it sounded different, distorted and unnaturally deep, like someone had slowed down a recording. "There, surrounding the truck. Lights everywhere. Can't see the road." Jack gripped the radio tighter. "Liam, pull over if you can't see. What mile marker are you near?" The only response was a series of disjointed words, barely audible beneath the intensifying static. Then, piercing through the white noise, came three unmistakable words. "They're taking me." A scream tore through the speaker, not of pain, but of pure terror, before the connection went completely dead. Jack frantically tried to re-establish contact, calling Liam's handle repeatedly, while Russet began to howl beside him. When that failed, he immediately radioed the nearest emergency dispatcher and reported the incident, though he could only provide a rough estimate of Liam's location based on their earlier conversation. The authorities launched a search operation that same night. State patrol, local sheriff departments, and even volunteer search and rescue teams combed every mile of Highway 12. Helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the dense forests on either side of the road. Liam's truck company dispatched their own search team. Days passed with no sign of either Liam or his 18-wheeler, a massive vehicle that should have been impossible to miss. The search expanded, theories multiplied, and Liam's family arrived from Spokane, their faces etched with a grief that deepened with each passing hour. Then, on the 7th day, something unexpected happened. A family returning from a camping trip spotted a man wandering along a remote logging road nearly 30 miles from Highway 12, an area that had already been searched multiple times. The man was barefoot, dressed only in tattered jeans, and a flannel shirt despite the near-freezing temperatures. He carried no identification, appeared severely dehydrated, and most disturbingly would not, or could not speak. When the authorities arrived, they identified him as Liam. Though physically intact apart from some unusual circular burns on his wrists and ankles, he was profoundly changed. His eyes held a vacant stare, and he didn't recognize his wife of 23 years or his 3 children. Most puzzling of all, there was still no sign of his truck anywhere in the region. The medical team at St. Patrick's Hospital in Missoula ran every test imaginable. CT scans, MRIs, toxicology screens, all came back normal except for unusual activity in his temporal lobe. The doctors diagnosed him with a rare form of dissociative amnesia, possibly triggered by extreme psychological trauma. But what could have caused such trauma remained a mystery. Liam never spoke another word. Not to his family, not to investigators, not to the parade of specialists who examined him over the following years. Whatever happened during those 7 missing days remained locked inside him, inaccessible even to himself. He would occasionally draw the same strange symbol, a series of interconnected hexagons, but no one could determine its significance. Perhaps most disturbing was his reaction whenever aircraft flew overhead. He would become visibly distressed, trembling violently and seeking shelter. His eyes filled with recognition of something no one else could see. Local theories ranged from government experiments gone wrong to supernatural entities. The more rational blamed a stroke or seizure that caused Liam to crash somewhere remote, though that never explained the missing truck or how he traveled so far on foot through such rugged terrain. Uncle Jack visited him faithfully every month until Liam passed away in 2008. He remained convinced that something beyond our understanding happened that night. He pointed to the fact that in the months following Liam's disappearance, 3 other truckers reported seeing unusual lights in that same stretch of Highway 12, though none experienced anything beyond brief radio interference. Most telling was a detail Jack rarely shared outside family. 2 weeks after Liam was found, Jack received a package with no return address. Inside was Liam's distinctive silver belt buckle, the one he was wearing the night he vanished, along with a handwritten note containing just 3 words: "We're being watched." The package was postmarked from a town that doesn't exist. Liam's truck was never found. The official investigation remains open, but inactive. The recording of that final radio transmission was logged as evidence by the Idaho State Police. But despite multiple Freedom of Information Act requests from UFO researchers and journalists, it has never been released. Sometimes when I'm driving through remote areas at night, I find myself scanning the ridgelines, wondering if those lights might appear. And I never, ever drive those roads alone. My name is Rebecca, and I need to share what happened to me. It's not easy to relive these moments, but if my story can warn other women, then it's worth it. We never imagine something terrible could happen to us until it does. It all began in the fall of 1997 when I met Julian. He wasn't like the other clients at the small photography studio where I worked in downtown Seattle, always impeccably dressed in vintage suits, with that confident smile of someone who seemed to have everything under control. Our first session was ordinary enough. He arrived exactly on time, courteous and well-spoken. He talked about art exhibitions, obscure films, and philosophical theories, topics that weren't common in these professional settings. He seemed harmless, intellectual even. But then came the first red flag. At the end of our session, as I was preparing to pack up my equipment, he asked for a special memento. He looked directly at the handcrafted silver pendant I was wearing, a family heirloom from my grandmother. "That pendant is exquisite," he said, his voice velvet smooth. "Could I keep it, just to remember our session together?" I felt immediate discomfort crawl up my spine. Who asks for something so personal? But he spoke in such a measured, reasonable tone that I thought maybe I was overreacting. He seemed like a normal, educated man. So against my better judgment, I unclasped the necklace and handed it to him. After years of dealing with difficult clients in the arts district, you learn to avoid confrontation. Something didn't sit right with me that night, though. I arrived home and tried to forget about it. But the way he had held the pendant up to the light, the peculiar gleam in his eyes as he smiled, I couldn't quite explain it, but it felt wrong. Julian became a regular client, always booking sessions for Wednesday afternoons. He never canceled, never rescheduled, and initially seemed benign. But as time passed, things started getting unsettling. His questions became more invasive. "Do you have many repeat clients like me? What's your routine outside the studio? Which coffee shops do you frequent when you're writing?" I tried to be evasive, but he was persistent, almost methodical in his approach. Then came another request. He wanted a strip of film from one of our sessions. "Your photography is so distinctive," he said. "I'd like to keep a negative, just a small piece. Nothing that would make any difference to your portfolio." A chill ran through me. I made up some excuse about studio policy and changed the subject. But he didn't give up so easily. During subsequent sessions, the request would surface again, always delivered with the same eerie calmness. as if it were perfectly normal. That's when I began noticing other strange occurrences. One day, walking back to my apartment in Capitol Hill, I spotted a vintage Volvo parked across the street. I didn't immediately recognize it, but later realized it was Julian's car. Coincidence? Maybe, but it wasn't the only time. He seemed to materialize everywhere. At the corner bookstore I frequented, at the farmer's market on Sundays, in the background of a friend's Instagram post from a gallery opening I had attended. My intuition began screaming that something was seriously wrong with Julian. And if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that we need to listen to our intuition. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of Julian's Volvo parked on the corner of my street haunted me. I had no concrete evidence of anything sinister, but my intuition insisted he was watching me, and the thought made my skin crawl. I decided to investigate. Starting with social media, his profile initially seemed ordinary: photos of scenic hikes in the Cascades, first edition books, and occasional captions about appreciating the unique beauty in each person. But in the comments section, something disturbing emerged. Several women tagged him with cryptic messages. "Thank you for safeguarding something so special from me." Special. Like what? The following week, I got more answers. I followed Julian after one of our sessions, one of the riskiest things I've ever done. He drove to an isolated Victorian house near the outskirts of Woodinville, surrounded by towering Douglas firs. From the outside, it looked like a normal historic home, but something about it sent shivers through me. I waited until the lights went out. Then, with my heart pounding against my ribs and hands trembling, I decided to circle the property. The basement door was unlocked. I don't know where I found the courage, but I entered. The smell inside was suffocating, a mixture of dampness and something sickeningly sweet that made me nauseous. That's when I saw it. There was an altar at the back of the basement. Not a religious one, something personal and grotesque. Shelves upon shelves filled with small objects. Pendants, earrings, pieces of fabric, strips of film negatives, and even locks of hair. I recognized my grandmother's pendant there, prominently displayed in the center. But that wasn't all. There were photographs of women I didn't know. Some looked happy, caught in candid moments. Others appeared frightened, as if they were being observed without their knowledge. Then I recognized something that made my blood freeze. A press pass belonging to a local journalist who had disappeared 7 months earlier. I knew because her case had been featured on every news channel. She was never found. My stomach churned. I heard footsteps above me. Julian had returned. Panic seized me. I was in his basement with my phone in hand, recording everything. He couldn't find me there. I turned off my phone's flashlight and hid behind some antique steamer trunks. The footsteps grew closer. He descended slowly, whistling a classical melody that I recognized as Bach. "I know someone's here," he said, his voice unnervingly calm and low, which made it even more terrifying. "You can come out. I just want to talk." My hand was shaking so violently I nearly dropped my phone. I took a deep breath, and in a moment of either courage or desperation, I bolted toward the stairs. He tried to grab me, but I pushed him with all the strength I could muster. He stumbled backward into his macabre collection. I scrambled up the steps, tripping several times before reaching the front door. He was coming after me, but he tripped over one of the trunks in the basement. That's what saved me. I ran like I'd never run before, got into my car, and drove straight to the police station without thinking twice. Even after handing over the video and describing the objects I'd seen in the basement to the police, the feeling of relief didn't come. Julian was arrested that same night. They found more than I had imagined: records of other women, personal items, and even journals with disturbing details about each of them. It was as if he collected fragments of each woman's life, a bizarre trophy of his obsession. But for me, the story was far from over. In the days that followed, I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly. Sleep became almost impossible. Every unusual sound made me jump. I knew Julian was in custody, but that didn't make me feel safe. He wasn't just any predator. He knew how to infiltrate your life without you noticing. I wondered how many women like me had ignored that initial discomfort, that chill down their spine until it was too late. During the trial, he acted as if none of it was serious. Sitting there in his perfectly tailored suit, he still wore that same calm smile, as if he were the most innocent man in the world. He even looked at me once, directly into my eyes, and smiled. It was the last time I saw that smile, but the image still haunts me. Justice was served, they say, but nobody talks about the sleepless nights, the months trying to rebuild my life, and the fear I still feel every time I hear footsteps behind me on the street. Life was never the same again. I decided to share my story because I know I'm not the only one. I know many women ignore small signs like I did. Sometimes we think we're overreacting, that it's all in our heads. But let me tell you something. Listen to your intuition. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Today, I live more cautiously. I moved to a different city, changed my routine, and always let someone know where I am. It might seem like paranoia, I know. But after everything I've been through, I've learned that it's better to err on the side of caution than to overlook something that could cost you your life. So if you're listening to this now, remember my words. Trust your instincts, take care of yourself, and never let yourself be convinced by a smile that seems harmless. I almost paid the ultimate price for ignoring the signs. Don't make the same mistake. My story is a warning, and if it can prevent another woman from going through what I experienced, then perhaps all of this will have been worth it. You know that weird feeling you get sometimes? That little voice inside your head saying, "Don't do it." Well, I should have listened, but like most people, I thought nothing bad would ever happen to me. It was a Tuesday evening in December, and I was finishing up my shift at the rideshare company dispatch center when a call came in on my personal line. The voice on the other end was deep and refined, almost too polite. He introduced himself as someone who appreciates discretion and wanted to book a private late-night ride with me specifically, not through the app. Red flag number 1, right? But here's the thing. He offered me 3 times the normal rate, cash. The kind of money that makes you ignore every warning sign flashing in your brain. He asked to meet at an old drive-in theater on the outskirts of town that had been closed for years. When I pulled up to the spot, my stomach immediately knotted. The place was bathed in this eerie blue moonlight, with patches of fog rolling across the empty lot. There he was, leaning against a sleek black Cadillac, dressed like he'd stepped out of a business meeting. Crisp charcoal suit, leather gloves despite the mild winter we were having. He looked normal enough, but there was something about his eyes, a coldness that sent shivers down my spine. Not the usual "this guy's creepy" feeling, but something deeper, more primal, like looking at something wearing human skin. We got into his car. He insisted on driving, and he started making conversation, asking unusually personal questions. Did I have family nearby? Did anyone know where I was tonight? Who would miss me if I didn't come home? I deflected, pretending to be distracted by the scenery as we drove further from town. I noticed he kept adjusting the radio volume, turning it up suddenly whenever the conversation lulled. It was like he was trying to cover something up. That's when I heard it for the first time, a muffled sound coming from the trunk. It was faint, but it sounded like a whimper. I tried to keep my voice casual when I joked, "Got someone locked in there." He gave this dry laugh that made my blood freeze and said, "Don't worry. It's just my favorite doll." My mind went blank. What kind of answer was that? I looked at him, trying to gauge if he was joking or serious. He smiled at me, but his eyes remained dead. I didn't say anything else, but my uneasiness grew with every mile. He started deviating from the route he'd mentioned earlier, turning onto less traveled roads, then onto a dirt path that cut through dense pine forest. I told him I thought we should head back, but he insisted he knew a special place. He wanted to show me. As he drove deeper into the woods, the noise from the trunk returned, louder this time. My heart raced as I started imagining what might be in there. My head was filled with horrible thoughts, but I couldn't let it show. I told him I needed to stop somewhere, pretending I was feeling sick. He hesitated, clearly annoyed, but eventually pulled into an abandoned ranger station. The place was deserted, just the two of us. I rushed to the bathroom, trying to breathe deeply and come up with a plan. When I came back, he was distracted, typing something on his phone. That was my chance. With the excuse of grabbing something from my bag in the back seat, I went to the trunk and carefully opened it, my heart beating so fast I thought it would burst. Inside was a life-size doll, but unlike any doll I'd ever seen. Its eyes were sewn shut with black thread, its clothes stained with what looked like dried blood. Next to it was a small jewelry box containing a lock of auburn hair and a silver locket that didn't belong with the rest of the items. I closed the trunk quickly and returned to the front seat, trying to act like nothing had happened. He looked at me with a strange smile, as if he knew I'd seen something. After that, everything got worse. He started talking about how some things are too precious to share, and how he had preserved several of them. My heart was in my throat as he pulled the car to a stop on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, saying he wanted to show me something special. When he got out of the car, I knew it was my only chance. I grabbed the phone he'd left in the console and dialed 911 while searching for something in the car I could use as a weapon. I found a tire iron under the passenger seat. My plan was simple: run as soon as he was far enough from the car. The moment he walked toward the tree line, I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. He screamed, but I didn't look back. The trees all looked the same, and I could only think about reaching safety. Suddenly, I saw headlights on the road ahead. I started waving frantically, but it was him. He'd circled back around in the car. Just as he was about to reach me, I saw the flashing lights of police cars coming down the road. The police ordered him to stop and open the trunk. When they did, I saw the officer's eyes widen in shock. They removed the doll and began examining the other items. They discovered that the hair and locket belonged to women who had gone missing in 3 different states over the past 2 years. He was arrested on the spot. As I gave my statement, still shaking, the police told me he was wanted in connection with multiple disappearances across the Northeast. Apparently, he collected mementos from each victim and added them to his doll. To this day, I can't forget those sewn-shut eyes or that man's cold smile. That experience changed my life. Now I always trust my instincts. I'm sharing this story because I want you to do the same. Never ignore that feeling that something's wrong. Trust yourself. It's better to miss an opportunity than to risk your life. Because sometimes, that little voice in your head is the only thing standing between you and someone else's trunk. Has it ever happened to you that you felt something wasn't right, but ignored that feeling because you thought it was just your imagination playing tricks on you? That's exactly what happened to me on that cold winter night in Chicago, on December 29th, 2010. I was 32 years old. I worked as an interpreter for foreign delegations. Not what I had dreamed of all my life, but the job paid my bills and helped finance my second degree. I was always careful with the people I worked with, checking references, analyzing profiles, confident I could recognize danger. At least that's what I thought until that fateful meeting. He seemed like the perfect client, educated, elegantly dressed, with a calm voice and the manner of a man who wasn't in a hurry. The kind of man who makes a woman feel safe, you know. We arranged to meet at a luxurious hotel on the shore of Lake Michigan. The payment was generous, and the phone conversation was full of respect. Nothing about him seemed suspicious until I arrived there. The place was immaculate, like something from a movie. I went up to the suite and was greeted with a charming smile. Everything seemed normal, but as the evening progressed, he began asking questions that made me uncomfortable. Do you live alone? Does anyone know you're here? I tried to change the subject, but the uneasiness grew. When I said it was time for me to leave, he insisted I have one last glass of wine. I was polite but firm. Better not. I have an important meeting early tomorrow. That's when his smile disappeared. Before I could react, I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. Turning around, I saw another man behind me. Everything became blurry, a mixture of screams, despair, and darkness. When I came to, everything was wrong. I found myself in a cold, damp place, with chains on my wrists and ankles. My head was throbbing with pain, and fear seized my entire body. I wasn't alone. A young woman, perhaps 23 years old, was quietly sobbing in the corner. "Where are we?" I asked, trying not to panic. She looked at me with eyes full of terror. They brought us here. We're captives." That's when I realized I had fallen into the worst nightmare of my life. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it seemed like an eternity. The place was dark, with the smell of mold and fear permeating the walls. There were no windows, only metal doors that seemed insurmountable. The girl, whose name was Sophia, had been there for several weeks. At least that's what she thought. In this hell, time loses all meaning. Sophia told me about the kidnappers. They ran a human trafficking network and exploited women like us. They say no one will find us, that we're expendable, she whispered. My mind was in shock, but one thing I knew for certain: I wouldn't give up. The people who kept us there were cruel. They used words to break our spirit. Nobody cares about you, they said. Obey, and maybe you'll live another day. Sometimes it was even worse. When one of us tried to resist, punishment came quickly and mercilessly. And yet I observed everything, their every move, every routine. There had to be a weakness somewhere. Sophia was on the verge of despair, but I couldn't let that happen. We'll get out of here, Sophia. I don't know how, but we will. She looked at me as if I were crazy. Maybe I was, but the desire to survive was stronger than fear. One evening, something unusual happened. One of the kidnappers, clearly tired after a long shift, left his phone in the back pocket of his pants. He dozed off in a chair near our cages, and the phone slipped onto the floor. It was a small mistake, but in our situation, it was all we needed. Sophia, this is our chance, I whispered. We quickly devised a plan. I managed to reach the phone through the bars of our cage. My hands were trembling when I dialed emergency services. Before I could say a word, the kidnapper woke up. He lunged at me with fury in his eyes. "What have you done?" he roared, tearing the phone from my hands. But it was too late. The call had gone through. He looked at the screen in confusion when suddenly sirens wailed. Evidently, the police had been able to track our location. The kidnapper panicked. He opened our cage, grabbed me by the hair, and dragged me toward the exit, probably planning to use me as a hostage. Sophia, gathering all her courage, grabbed a metal food tray and hit him on the head. He fell and we ran. The corridors were a labyrinth, and my heart was beating so loudly I thought they could hear it. We almost reached the exit when the other kidnappers noticed us. "Run, Sophia," I shouted. But at the last second, they caught her. Everything inside me screamed to keep running, to save my own life, but I couldn't. I returned with adrenaline I didn't even know I possessed. I fought with the kidnapper, using everything I could: nails, teeth, even a stone I found on the floor. It was brutal, but it worked. Sophia and I escaped through the back doors of the building and ran through the industrial district, not looking back. We ran until our legs gave out. Fortunately, we found a gas station where an employee helped us. He called the police, and for the first time I felt we were safe. But freedom had a bitter taste. What we had experienced left deep scars. I looked at Sophia as the ambulance took us away. We had survived, but we knew we would never be the same again. Today I'm telling this story because I feel I must do so. It's not easy to talk about what happened. The fear, the pain, the feeling that the whole world has forgotten you. These are things I wouldn't wish even on my worst enemy. The police were able to uncover part of the network that kidnapped us. But I know there are still many women who weren't as fortunate as we were. So I want you to hear me. Trust your intuition. If something seems wrong, it probably is. Take care of yourself, and if you can, speak up, share your story as I'm doing now. Together, we can create a safer world. This is my way of surviving what happened, turning fear into strength. I hope that somehow this will inspire you too. Stay vigilant and please, take care of yourself. You know that feeling when something's not right, but you can't explain it. That's exactly how it was that evening. I was standing at my usual spot near the old harbor dock. A routine that, I'll admit, isn't the greatest, but it's part of my life. I watched boats passing by, some people looking my way, others pretending not to see me. It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening. Until it wasn't. Everything started when I felt a touch on my shoulder. At first, I thought someone was trying to get my attention, but when I turned around, there was nobody there. Nothing. I looked around, but there wasn't a single soul near me. I shrugged it off, laughing at myself. Just my imagination, I thought. But then it happened again. And again. Only this time, the touch was accompanied by a chill that ran up my spine. The sensation was ice cold, you know. Like when you touch something that's been in the freezer too long. I started feeling strange, as if someone was watching me, but there was nobody there. The dock seemed emptier than ever, and the silence, oh, that silence was what scared me the most. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. But the uneasiness only grew with each passing minute. It felt like the air around me was getting heavier. And that's when it began. First, a quiet sound, like someone whispering. I looked behind me again, thinking it might be some prankster trying to scare me, but no one was there. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, words I couldn't understand. The worst part was when I felt the touch again, except this time it wasn't just a touch. It felt like fingernails digging into my shoulder. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. When I looked, I couldn't believe it. There were red marks on my skin, as if someone had actually grabbed me there. But again, there was nobody. I took a deep breath and decided it was time to head home. As I walked, I felt observed, like something was following me. But I didn't have the courage to look back. I reached my apartment faster than ever, closed the door, and leaned against it, trying to understand what was happening. Was I going crazy, or was something really there with me? When I finally managed to calm my breathing, I went straight to the bathroom. I wanted to wash my face and try to forget everything that had happened. I turned on the light, but it started flickering as if teasing me. Not now, I thought, already irritated, as I looked at myself in the mirror. Then I felt that chill again. That's when I saw it, right there behind me in the reflection, a shadow. It wasn't mine. It was tall, seemed undefined, as if covered by a dark mist. I froze. I couldn't move a muscle or find the courage to turn around. Nothing was there. Absolutely nobody. My heart was racing, but still, I kept staring at the mirror. Something inside me said that if I looked away, it would get worse. That's when it started. First, the towel hanging nearby fell to the floor without anyone touching it. Then the soap slipped off the sink. Each little sound seemed like a thunderclap in that absurdity. And then once more I felt it, the touch on my shoulder. This time it was so strong that it felt like someone was really behind me, pulling me. I ran out. I didn't want to know what it was, didn't want to see anything else. I locked myself in my bedroom, sat on the floor with my back against the door, and stayed there, shaking, trying to figure out what to do. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. The next day, I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. I called my friend Thomas and told him everything. "You need to investigate this," he said. At first I laughed. Investigate what? But the truth is, that idea kept hammering in my head. I spent the afternoon researching the area around the harbor where I usually worked. What I found gave me goosebumps. I discovered that 19 years ago, a woman had disappeared near there. She was known for frequenting the area, and one day she simply vanished. Nobody knew what had happened, but some locals said that ever since then, strange things happened around that dock. People reported hearing footsteps, whispers, and feeling cold touches, just like what I had felt. The story left me uneasy. Could that be it? Could that woman somehow still be trapped there in some form? I didn't really believe in these things, but after what I'd experienced, it was hard to ignore. I decided I needed to know more. Perhaps understanding what was happening was the key to ending it. That night I stayed awake, reading everything I could about the case. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't just an old story. Something was still very wrong in that place, and now it had reached out to me. I decided I couldn't continue like this. I needed to face it head-on, even though fear made me want to run away. The following evening, I returned to the dock. I confess my hand was trembling as I held my bag, and my steps felt so heavy, it seemed like the ground would give way. I stayed there for a while, looking around as if expecting something to happen. Nothing. Everything was too normal, and that made me even more tense. It was like the calm before a storm. That's when I felt it again, the cold touch, but this time on my arm. I took a deep breath, trying not to scream. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice shaking. I wasn't sure if I expected an answer, or just wanted to drive away the fear. Suddenly, I heard it. It wasn't just a whisper this time, but a clear, desperate voice. "Help me." It was a female voice, hoarse, almost muffled. My eyes filled with tears. I don't know if from fear or from feeling the intense pain in her voice. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I asked, but there was no response, just the same cold silence all around. I started looking around for something, anything that might explain it, but it was as if the whole world had stopped for a few seconds. In that moment, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was there, and it needed me. The next day, I went looking for help. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I remembered an old man in my neighborhood who had a reputation for understanding these things. I didn't know him well, but honestly, I was willing to try anything. I knocked on his door late in the afternoon, and as soon as I told him my story, he looked at me with a serious expression. "You're dealing with a trapped spirit, probably because of something very bad that happened," he said, while handling some candles and crystals he had on his table. I didn't know if I believed it or thought it was all crazy, but everything made sense. "She wants justice. She wants you to listen," he continued. He asked me to describe what I had felt and heard, and after a few minutes of conversation, he did something that gave me chills. He pulled an old newspaper from under the table and pointed to a news story. It was about the woman who had disappeared near that dock. "It's her," he said. "She's trying to show you something." I left there with a lump in my throat and a weight on my chest. Knowing it was real only made everything more frightening. But at the same time, I began to feel a strange desire to help. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about giving peace to someone who was clearly trapped in terrible suffering. Going back to that dock, that night, was the hardest thing I've ever done. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the air around seemed colder, denser. I was carrying some things the old man had given me: a white candle, a piece of paper with something written on it that I didn't understand, and a small bell. "This will help," he had said, but I wasn't so confident. When I got there, I took a deep breath and positioned myself in the same place where everything had started. I lit the candle with trembling hands and closed my eyes. I didn't really know what to do, but I decided I would speak, even if it seemed crazy. "I know you're here. I know you need help. Tell me what you want me to do." For a moment, nothing happened, but then the wind began to blow, and I heard it again: "Help me." Only this time the voice was clearer, closer. The bell in my hand started to ring on its own, and I felt the same touch on my shoulder, now stronger, as if someone wanted to pull me. "You need to show me what happened to you," I asked, holding back tears. The wind grew stronger, and then I saw it. I don't know how to explain, but it was like a flash images of a woman being attacked at that very dock. She tried to scream, but no one came to help her. Her face was the same as in the newspaper photo. My body went cold as I felt all the pain and despair she must have felt. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and that's when I realized what I needed to do. The next day, I went straight to the police station with everything I knew. I told them about the story I had found in the newspaper, the strange things that had happened, and even about the old man who had helped me. Of course, I left out the supernatural details. Who would believe that, right? But I talked about the woman's disappearance and suggested that maybe it was worth investigating again. The officers at first looked at me like I was crazy, but one of them, an older detective, seemed to understand the gravity. He promised to look at the old files, and to my surprise, a few weeks later, I received a call. They had found evidence that the woman had been murdered there, just as I had seen, and thanks to that, they were able to link the crime to someone who was already imprisoned for something else. Justice was finally served. After that, I never felt that touch again or heard the whispers. The dock that used to give me chills now seemed just like any other place. But deep down, I knew I would never forget that experience. I don't know why she chose me, but I feel I did something important, something that really mattered. Today I'm sharing this story because I know that, deep down, these things are real. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not, they exist. And sometimes all they need is for someone to listen. Hey everyone, my name is Jessica, and what I'm about to share today isn't easy, but I feel it's necessary. I work as a high-end companion in New Orleans, and despite always being careful, I lived through an experience that changed my life forever. This story is a warning, especially for women, about how danger can lurk closer than we imagine. It all started on a foggy November evening with a message on my private line. It was from a client named Marcus. His approach was so polite, so thoughtful that it caught me off guard. He mentioned finding me through a private network where I advertise my services and wanted to arrange a meeting. Nothing unusual so far. But then he did something that caught my attention. He insisted our first meeting take place at a public restaurant in the French Quarter so I would feel safer. I was slightly suspicious because clients rarely show this level of concern, but I ended up thinking it was a sign of respect. I accepted the dinner invitation. Marcus seemed very different from other clients. He spoke eloquently, dressed with subtle elegance, and seemed genuinely interested in making me feel comfortable. Looking back now, I realize he knew exactly what he was doing. The day arrived, and there I was, at an upscale jazz restaurant with that butterfly feeling you get when meeting someone new. He was waiting at a corner table with a calm smile. The conversation flowed naturally, without any pressure. He seemed perfectly crafted, like someone had designed him specifically to make women feel at ease. At the end of the evening, he suggested a second meeting, this time at a luxury hotel in the Garden District, something more private. Marcus offered a payment high enough to make me ignore that discomfort bubbling up deep inside. I had my reservations, but he was so convincing, so attentive that I ended up saying yes. I left that dinner with a strange feeling. Marcus seemed too perfect, yet somehow harmless. That's what made me lower my guard, and that's what I want to warn you about. Never ignore the signals. In the days that followed, I started noticing odd things about him. First, he had no social media presence. No Instagram, no LinkedIn, nothing. I searched his number online, but nothing reliable came up. Still, he kept sending polite messages about our upcoming meeting at the hotel. When I asked about the reservation, he said he'd made it under a friend's name because he wanted discretion. At the time, it sounded like an excuse, but I ignored it, thinking I was being paranoid. I decided to take precautions. I told my friend Zoe about the meeting and arranged to share my real-time location with her. We also established a code. If I texted call Lyft, she would know something was wrong and should act immediately. This gave me some security, but I still had no idea what was coming. I arrived at the hotel, a restored 19th century mansion, and immediately sensed something was off. The receptionist said there was no reservation under the name he had given me. I called him, and he appeared at the reception desk a few minutes later with a ready excuse. Oh, must have been a system error. Let's go up, everything's set. In the elevator, he seemed different, more serious, less friendly. We entered the room, and the first thing I noticed was the strong masculine cologne scent, as if someone had just left. My body froze, but I kept calm while he spoke. I caught a shadow in the mirror, reflecting something that shouldn't have been there. I pretended not to notice, but started formulating a plan. My heart was racing. I knew that showing fear could make things worse. He began acting stranger, avoiding eye contact, fidgeting with his phone. That's when the bathroom door opened, and another man stepped out. They looked at each other and laughed. My instinct was to get up and leave, but Marcus locked the door before I could do anything. Jessica, it's better if you don't make a scene. We just want to take a few things, and you can leave here without any problems. He pointed to my purse, my phone, and began demanding passwords for accounts and transfers. While he was talking, I remained calm and said I would cooperate, but needed my phone to make the transfers. When I grabbed my phone, I discreetly sent the code to Zoe Call Lyft. The minutes that followed were terrifying. They ransacked my purse, laughing while talking about what they would do if I didn't cooperate. I was just thinking about how to buy time until help arrived. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. My heart stopped. It was hotel security, and the voice from outside shouted, "Open now or we're coming in." Marcus tried to stay calm, but the other man panicked and ran to the bathroom. Before he could lock the door, security burst into the room. Everything happened quickly. I was immediately escorted out while they were restrained and taken away by the police, who had arrived moments after security. Outside, Zoe was waiting for me, crying but relieved. I threw myself into her arms and started crying too. What could have been the worst day of my life ended with a relief I can't describe. After that night, my life changed completely. I realized that no matter how safe you think you are, danger can appear where you least expect it. Marcus was the perfect client, only because he knew exactly how to appear trustworthy. That's why I want to leave this warning for you. Always share information with someone you trust, create safety codes, and above all, listen to your instincts. Having shared my location and warned Zoe meant that I'm here to tell this story today. And please, if this story helped you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I want to continue bringing warnings and accounts that can help other people. Thank you for listening until the end, and always stay safe. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.